Welcome to this journey through one of the most heartbreaking and forgotten stories buried in early American colonial history. Before we begin, take a moment to leave a comment telling us where you are listening from and the exact time right now. These stories were meant to be erased by time, but somehow they survived. What you are about to hear is not a legend, it is not folklore, nor a romantic exaggeration. It is the true account of two souls who defied every law of their world, who loved when love was forbidden, and dreamed of freedom in an age where freedom belonged to very few. In the dry frontier lands of colonial North America, where the sun burned the soil for half the year and dust clung to every breath, stood a remote estate known simply as Solitude Plantation. The name would prove painfully accurate. The year was 1743. Nearby settlement of Redstone Valley was experiencing its greatest prosperity. Driven by silver extraction from deep mountain mines, wealth flowed eastward toward European investors, while the local land absorbed only suffering, broken bodies, and silence. The town held nearly 8,000 residents, English-born elites, ambitious colonial families, mixed heritage laborers struggling for status, displaced native tribes, and African slaves brought across the ocean in chains to work mines and plantations. Solitude Plantation stood several miles northeast of the settlement, in a harsh region where dry land was occasionally interrupted by narrow strips of fertile soil fed by mountain streams. It was not a sugar estate like those farther south, but a mixed operation: small-scale silver mining, cattle grazing, and the cultivation of corn and wheat. The main house was built from rose-colored stone, quarried from nearby hills. Its thick walls resembled those of a fort, designed to withstand both brutal summers and the threat of frontier raids from native groups still resisting colonial expansion. The owner of Solitude Plantation was Colonel Nathaniel Hawthorne, a man of 57 whose body reflected a lifetime untouched by hunger or restraint. His heavy frame strained against his tailored waist coat. His flushed face, aged by decades of imported rum and wine, spoke of power exercised without consequence. Nathaniel Hawthorne had arrived in the colonies 40 years earlier as a man with little inheritance, but through ruthless ambition, calculated marriages, and strategic alliances, he rose to become one of the wealthiest men in the region. He controlled 3 silver mines, 2 cattle estates, and Solitude Plantation, his favored residence, where he spent most of the year. In those days, the air of Redstone Valley constantly smelled of dry earth and metal. Dust rose with every step, settling into clothes, food, and lungs alike. The streets were packed dirt, lined with stone and timber buildings topped with clay-tiled roofs. The town's central church dominated the square, its bell tower rising toward an almost perpetually clear sky. On Sundays, colonial families gathered in fine dress, women in imported fabrics, men in heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats, an image of civility and order. But beneath that surface lay a system built entirely on exploitation. Thousands of native laborers worked the mines under conditions that destroyed their bodies within years, inhaling metallic dust that hardened their lungs. On plantations, African slaves worked from dawn until nightfall, legally defined as property bought, sold, and inherited like livestock. Solitude Plantation alone held 64 enslaved men and women. They lived in a long wooden barracks with dirt floors and straw roofs, divided into cramped sections where entire families shared spaces barely large enough to lie down. There were no windows, only narrow cracks to let air pass through. In summer, the barracks became suffocating ovens. In winter, the cold crept in relentlessly through every seam. Inside the main house of Solitude Plantation, built around a central courtyard with a stone well, lived Colonel Hawthorne's deepest, most carefully hidden secret, his daughter, Eleanor Hawthorne. Eleanor Hawthorne had been born in the year 1720, the only child of Colonel Nathaniel Hawthorne's lawful marriage. Her mother, Margaret Caldwell Hawthorne, came from a respected colonial family, but she died just 3 days after childbirth, taken by fever before she ever had the chance to hold her daughter. From the beginning, Eleanor's life unfolded in quiet absence. She grew up without a mother, raised instead by native servants and enslaved women who cared for her in the rear rooms of the plantation house. Her father rarely visited. Days, sometimes weeks, would pass without him asking after her. As a child, Eleanor was gentle, curious, and unusually intelligent. She learned to listen before she spoke. She learned early that silence was safer than attention. But by the age of 10, something became impossible to ignore. Her body began to change in ways no one understood. While other girls grew slowly and evenly, Eleanor gained weight rapidly and disproportionately. By 15 an age, when daughters of prominent families were expected to attract suitors, her body had grown so large that she outweighed grown women twice her age. Walking more than a few steps left her breathless, painful. Sores formed where her skin rubbed constantly against itself. Her face, framed by thick folds of flesh, still held traces of beauty. Deep green eyes inherited from her mother, long dark lashes, and a soft expression filled with kindness. But society did not see kindness. It saw difference. Colonel Hawthorne summoned doctors from the settlement, then healers. Then a traveling European surgeon, passing through the frontier. Each gave a different explanation using different words, but the conclusion was always the same. It was a constitutional disorder, an imbalance of humors, a punishment from God. There was no cure. At 18, Eleanor's fate was sealed. 2 years earlier, her father had made one final attempt to present her to colonial society during a formal gathering at the plantation. When Eleanor entered the room supported by 2 servants, whispers spread instantly. Pity, horror, disgust, poorly disguised as politeness. Colonel Hawthorne felt something break inside him that night. Not love, not concern, but pride. After the guests departed, he made his decision. Eleanor would no longer be seen. She would live hidden, as if she had never existed. From that night onward, Eleanor spent her days confined to a large but suffocating room in the farthest corner of the plantation house. The walls were thick stone, painted white. One narrow high window looked onto an inner courtyard no one ever used. The furniture was sparse, a custom-built bed reinforced with heavy beams to support her weight, a leather chair where she spent most of her waking hours, and a table constantly covered with trays of food. Because Colonel Hawthorne decided that if his daughter could not be beautiful, if she could not marry or produce heirs, then at least she would never go hungry. 3 times a day, trusted enslaved women brought her meals: fresh bread, stewed meats, thick gravies, sweet puddings, corn dishes, and sugared drinks. Eleanor ate not out of hunger, but out of emptiness. Food became the only pleasure allowed to her. Each bite briefly filled the hollow space left by a life without purpose. The only people who saw her regularly were 2 enslaved women, Mary, in her 40s, who had nursed Eleanor as an infant and still cared for her with quiet compassion, and Ruth, younger and physically strong, responsible for the exhausting labor of changing linens and helping Eleanor bathe once a week. Despite her confinement, Eleanor was not entirely uneducated. A sympathetic chaplain hired briefly by Colonel Hawthorne had taught her to read before being dismissed for being too soft on servants and slaves. Books became Eleanor's only window to the world. Religious texts. Poetry. A worn copy of Don Quixote, translated into English. So many times she memorized entire passages. At night, when the heat faded and a faint breeze slipped through the narrow window, Eleanor would sit in her chair and stare at the stars. She could barely see. She imagined other lives, other bodies, other worlds where she was not treated as a mistake. Sometimes she cried silently. Other times, she simply stared, watching days dissolve into weeks, and weeks into unmourned. Unseen. And while Eleanor lived hidden in stone and silence, another life unfolded in the shadows of Solitude Plantation. A man named Caleb Freeman. Caleb Freeman had been born on Solitude Plantation in the year 1712. He never knew freedom, not even as a word. His father, Kofi, had been taken from the western coast of Africa while still a boy, captured by traders and shipped across the ocean in chains. His mother, Hannah, had been born free but lost her liberty when she married an enslaved man, law that turned love itself into a punishment. Caleb grew up knowing exactly where he stood in the world. He belonged to someone else. By the age of 12, he was already working beside grown men. By 15, his hands were permanently scarred. His body carried the evidence of decades of brutal labor. Caleb worked in the plantation's silver foundry, where raw ore was melted down in furnaces that burned hotter than hell itself. The heat blistered skin, molten metal, splashed without warning, toxic smoke filled lungs until breathing felt like swallowing fire. Most men lasted only a few years, before sickness or injury killed them. Caleb survived. His body was strong, compact, built by years of relentless work. His skin bore dozens of small circular scars marks, left where droplets of liquid silver had struck bare flesh. But what made Caleb truly different was not his strength. It was his mind. His father, Kofi, had once been taught to read by missionaries before his capture. At night, in secret, he passed that knowledge to his son, drawing letters in dirt with a stick, wiping them away before overseers came. Kofi died when Caleb was 15, crushed beneath a collapsing beam in the foundry. His mother followed 3 years later, consumed by illness and exhaustion. Caleb buried them both himself, behind the slave barracks, carving crude wooden crosses with his own hands. After that, something inside him hardened. Women in the barracks noticed him. Some tried to grow close, young women hoping for protection or companionship in a life with few choices. Caleb refused them gently. He could not imagine bringing children into a world like this. He could not watch his own blood grow up in chains. At night, while others gathered around small fires to trade rumors and stories, Caleb withdrew into the shadows. By candlelight stolen from the plantation chapel, he practiced writing on scraps of discarded paper taken from the main house. He wrote about his parents, about freedom, about the cruelty of a world where skin color decided destiny. But Caleb was not reckless. He had seen men try to escape. He had watched them dragged back, beaten until their backs split open, then sold to distant mines where survival rarely lasted 2 years. Freedom, he learned, was dangerous to even imagine so. He lowered his head, worked harder than anyone else, stayed invisible. Freedom was his daily goal, until one afternoon in August of 1743. Heat that day was unbearable. The air felt thick, heavy, almost solid. Even the plantation dogs lay motionless in the shade, too exhausted to bark. Caleb was working at the furnace when an overseer stormed in, shouting his name. The plantation owner wanted to see him. Caleb's heart pounded. In 31 years, he had never been summoned to the main house. Only domestic servants crossed that threshold, never foundry workers. He washed himself as best he could, scrubbing soot from his arms and face. He put on his least torn shirt, a once white garment now faded into dull gray. He followed the overseer through the orchard, past fruit rotting on the ground, untouched in the heat. The main house loomed before him, stone walls rising 3 stories high, iron-barred windows, carved columns framing the entrance like a warning. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with wealth. Paintings, mahogany furniture, a crucifix worth more than any slave could earn in a lifetime. Caleb stood waiting, silent. Then he was brought before Colonel Nathaniel Hawthorne. The man studied him slowly, the way one inspects a tool. Finally, he spoke. Caleb, Hawthorne said coldly, "I have made a decision that will change your life." Caleb said nothing. "You are to marry my daughter." For a moment, Caleb thought he had misheard. An enslaved black man marrying a white woman of colonial blood. It was madness. But the expression on Hawthorne's face made one thing clear. This was not a joke. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Caleb stood frozen, trying to understand what Colonel Hawthorne had just said. Marriage. To his daughter. The plantation owner leaned back in his chair, swirling dark liquor in a crystal glass. "I know what you're thinking," Hawthorne said calmly. "It violates every social order. A black slave marrying a white woman of standing." He took a slow sip. "But my daughter is 23. No man of my class will take her. Her condition makes her unsuitable." Caleb felt his chest tighten. He had never even seen Hawthorne's daughter. "You are strong," Hawthorne continued, "healthy, intelligent, and most importantly, you have no power to refuse." The marriage would take place in 1 week, in the plantation chapel. No guests, no celebration. In return, Hawthorne made a promise. "When I die," he said, "you will receive your freedom, provided you fulfill your duties as a husband and keep Eleanor content." Then his voice dropped. "If you harm her, if you try to run, if you cause me trouble, I will have you whipped until flesh falls from bone, then sold to the mountain mines. You will die there." Caleb nodded slowly. What else could he do? It was simply another form of slavery, this time disguised as marriage, yet buried beneath the fear. A small spark ignited. Freedom. Even distant, even conditional. It was more than most enslaved men ever dreamed of. "May I meet her before the wedding?" Caleb asked quietly. Hawthorne laughed, short and humorless. You will see her on the wedding day. The days that followed felt unreal. The news spread through the slave barracks like wildfire. Some looked at Caleb with envy, others with horror, a few with pity. An elderly enslaved woman approached him the night before the wedding. She was kind once, the woman whispered, before her father hid her away. She's a prisoner too, Caleb, remember that. The wedding took place at dawn. The plantation chapel was small, built of stone and wood, holding no more than 20 people. Only 3 were present. Colonel, Hawthorne, an aging priest, and Caleb. He wore borrowed clothing, ill-fitting trousers, a stained white shirt, worn shoes that pinched his feet, sweat-soaked, his back despite the morning chill. Then the side door opened. Eleanor entered. She was supported on both sides by enslaved women, her breathing heavy, each step an effort. The white dress she wore had clearly been altered from something meant for a smaller body fabric, stretched tight, seemed straining. A lace veil covered her face, but Caleb could see tears darkening the cloth. When she reached the altar, she did not look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the stone floor. The priest's voice trembled as he recited the vows. When instructed to join hands, Caleb hesitated, then slowly extended his Eleanor's hand, emerged from beneath the veil. It was small, cold, shaking when their skin touched. Caleb felt her flinch, not in disgust, but in terror. In that moment, something shifted inside him. This woman was not his enemy. She was another victim. Caleb gently closed his fingers around hers. Eleanor's grip tightened suddenly, desperately, like someone clinging to a lifeline in deep water. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the priest said quickly, relief evident in his voice. Colonel Hawthorne stood. It's done, he said flatly. Caleb, you will live in Eleanor's room. You will continue your labor by day. Your nights belong to your wife. The meaning was unmistakable. Later that evening, Caleb was led through the back corridors of the house and into Eleanor's chamber. The door closed behind him. Eleanor sat in a chair near the window, still in her wedding dress, veil discarded. For the first time, Caleb saw her face, fully green eyes red from crying, features gentle beneath the weight of her body. Silence stretched between them. Then Caleb spoke. I won't touch you, he said softly. Not unless you want me to. Eleanor looked up sharply. But my father, I don't care what he said. Caleb replied. I'm not an animal. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but relief. Why? She whispered. Because we're both prisoners, Caleb said, sitting against the far wall to give her space. And prisoners don't hurt each other. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. My name is Eleanor, she said quietly. Caleb, he answered, son of Kofi, slave of solitude. And in that room built for silence and shame, something unexpected began. Love. Not yet, but human dignity. The first days of their marriage passed in silence. Caleb left before sunrise each morning, returning long after dusk, his body coated in ash and sweat, his hands cracked and bleeding from the heat of the furnaces. Eleanor remained by the narrow window, watching light fade from the sky, listening for his footsteps. At night, they slept on opposite sides of the room. A narrow cot had been brought in for Caleb and placed as far from Eleanor's reinforced bed as possible. The distance between them felt deliberate, safe. Neither spoke much at first. They were bound by law, but separated by fear. Caleb washed himself quietly each night, using a basin left by the servants, then lay down without a word. Eleanor watched him from the corner of her eye, unsure of what to expect from a man the world told her she should fear. But nothing happened. Days turned into weeks. Silence slowly gave way to words. One night, Eleanor broke it. What do you read? She asked softly, holding a book open in her lap. Caleb looked surprised. Poetry, she continued, by a woman who was locked away like me. She writes about knowledge and injustice. Caleb sat against the wall, the same place he had chosen on their first night. May I hear it? He asked. Eleanor hesitated, then began to read aloud. Her voice trembled, at first unused, uncertain, but grew steadier with each line. The room filled with words about wisdom denied, about minds imprisoned long before bodies. When she finished, Caleb was silent. She's right, he finally said. They keep knowledge from us because knowledge makes people dangerous. Eleanor stared at him. You think I deserve more than this? She asked, gesturing to the room. More than being hidden like a shameful secret. Caleb met her eyes. I think everyone deserves more than what this world gives them. That night changed Everything. They began to talk. Eleanor told him about her childhood, the early years before her body changed, the doctors, the whispers, her father's growing disgust. She spoke of the 5 years locked away, of books as her only escape. Caleb told her about his parents, about Africa as his father remembered it, about the barracks, the foundry, the men who died young. He spoke of dreams he had buried long ago. They discovered how much they shared. Both had grown up without mothers. Both had been marked as less than human. Both had survived by retreating inward. They began to read together. Eleanor shared her small library. Caleb read when he could. Then they talked late into the night, debating stories, faith, justice, madness, and freedom. Caleb taught her numbers, explaining how overseers tracked production. Eleanor learned quickly, faster than he expected. In return, she taught him history and geography, telling him about lands far beyond Solitude Plantation. Slowly, Caleb moved his cot closer, not by command, not by fear, by trust. They spoke in whispers long after candles were blown out, voices low in the dark, clinging to each other's words like shelter from the world outside. One winter night, the cold seeped through the stone walls. Eleanor began to shake uncontrollably beneath her blankets. "I'm freezing," she whispered. Caleb stood. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her bed. "Please." He lay beside her, not touching at first, then slowly, carefully, wrapped an arm around her to share warmth. Her shaking eased. "Thank you," Eleanor murmured, "for treating me like a person." Caleb's voice cracked. "You are more human than anyone in this house." That night, they slept side by side for the first time, and somewhere between shared stories and shared silence, Caleb realized he had fallen in love, not with the body the world mocked, but with the mind that sought truth, with the kindness that survived cruelty, with the quiet courage that refused to break. And Eleanor, lying awake, listening to his breathing, felt something she had never known. She was no longer alone. Love did not arrive with passion. It arrived quietly. One night, after months of whispered conversations and shared thoughts, Eleanor closed her book and looked at Caleb differently, without fear, without shame. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. Caleb waited. "I never believed anyone could see me and stay," she continued, "but you did." He took her hand. "I see you," he said simply. That night, they chose each other not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Caleb was gentle, patient, reverent. He treated Eleanor's body not as something grotesque, but as something sacred. Eleanor cried, not from pain, but from release. For the first time in her life, she felt complete, loved, alive. The weeks that followed were the happiest either of them had ever known. They laughed. Quietly, they planned imaginary futures in whispers. They spoke of freedom like it was a fragile thing that might break if spoken too loudly. And then one night, Eleanor said the words that changed everything. With child, Caleb felt joy and terror collide. Inside his chest, a child, their child. But the world they lived in was not kind to forbidden unions. "What will happen?" Eleanor asked, one hand resting on her belly. Caleb did not lie. "I don't know," he said, "but I will protect you, both of you." Meanwhile, Colonel Hawthorne was fading. The man who once ruled Solitude Plantation with iron certainty, now coughed constantly. His hands shook when he signed documents. His skin turned pale and gray despite the sun. Caleb noticed everything. He saw servants whisper. He saw doctors arrive and leave. He saw fear creep into the plantation's rhythm at night. Caleb and Eleanor spoke of what might come. "When he dies," Caleb whispered, "he promised me freedom, and I would inherit solitude." Eleanor said quietly, "I could free the slaves, change everything." But doubt lingered. "My father has relatives," Eleanor added, "men who will not allow a woman like me to inherit." Still, hope took root. Eleanor was allowed into the inner courtyard, for short walks always with Caleb beside her. The first time she felt the open sky after years of confinement, she stood still, tears streaming down her face as sunlight touched her skin. Caleb watched her and made a vow, no matter what happened, he would never let her return to that room alone. Then, in early autumn, Colonel Nathaniel Hawthorne collapsed. The plantation fell into silence. Doctors arrived too late. Prayers were whispered. Too weakly. On October 5th, before dawn, Hawthorne died. And with the tolling of the chapel bell, everything Caleb and Eleanor had built began to collapse. Colonel Nathaniel Hawthorne was buried before the sun fully rose. Black cloth covered the windows of Solitude Plantation, but mourning was only a performance. Power never mourns, it reorganizes. Within hours of Hawthorne's death, his relatives arrived. The first was Edmund Hawthorne, his cousin from the eastern colonies, a thin man with sharp eyes and a smile that never reached them. He came with lawyers, documents, and certainty. By noon, Edmund had installed himself in the plantation office. That afternoon, everyone was summoned to the main courtyard. Slaves, servants, overseers. Caleb stood among them, his heart pounding. Eleanor remained locked in her room. Edmund stepped onto the balcony and unrolled a document. The last will of Colonel Nathaniel Hawthorne, he announced, according to the paper. Solitude Plantation and all its holdings were left to Edmund Hawthorne, with the condition that Eleanor would be housed and fed for life. There was no mention of Caleb's promised freedom, no mention of the marriage, no mention of the unborn child. It was as if Eleanor's life and their union had never existed. Caleb stepped forward. The marriage was lawful, he said. The chapel records. Edmund smiled coldly. The priest has been dismissed, he replied, and the records appear to be missing. An overseer held up a book with a torn page. There is no proof, Edmund said calmly, and therefore no marriage. Then he looked directly at Caleb. You, he said, pointing, return to the barracks. You are a slave. Always were. Two overseers seized Caleb by the arms. Eleanor screamed from the window above. Caleb shouted her name as he was dragged away, watching helplessly as iron bars closed between them. That night, Caleb was locked into a tiny compartment in the barracks, barely large enough to kneel. He punched the walls until his knuckles split, but rage turned into resolve. If the system would never grant freedom, he would take it. Edmund Hawthorne proved even crueler than his cousin. Food rations were cut, work quotas increased, punishments became public and brutal. A man was whipped unconscious for resting 5 minutes too long. A pregnant woman was beaten until she miscarried. Fear ruled Solitude Plantation. Eleanor lived her own nightmare. Her door was reinforced, extra locks were added, her meals reduced. She was forbidden to speak freely even to the women who cared for her. Worst of all was the threat. When the child is born, Edmund said coldly, it will be sold. Eleanor clutched her stomach in silence, whispering promises to a child she might never raise, but hope still breathed. One night, Mary slipped a folded scrap of paper under Eleanor's plate. I will get you out. I love you. Trust me. Caleb had begun planning. He contacted enslaved workers from nearby estates. Whispered rumors spoke of a free settlement in the mountains run by escaped slaves. The plan was dangerous, insane, but love had made Caleb fearless. Edmund Hawthorne planned a grand gathering on All Saints night. Wine would flow, guards would drink, attention would drift. That night, Solitude Plantation would burn. And in the chaos, Caleb would take back what was stolen. The night of All Saints' Day arrived beneath a cold, merciless sky. Solitude Plantation was alive with laughter. Candles burned in every hall. Wine flowed freely. Edmund Hawthorne's guests, wealthy men from neighboring estates, filled the house with careless confidence. Guards drank, overseers relaxed, discipline softened. That was the moment Caleb had been waiting for. Just after midnight, he and 6 trusted men moved toward the foundry. Oil was poured onto old beams, dry wood was stacked high. And with shaking hands but steady purpose, Caleb struck the flame. Fire erupted violently. Within minutes, the foundry was an inferno, flames climbing toward the sky, lighting the plantation like daylight. Shouts echoed, bells rang, chaos exploded in every direction. Guests fled the house, guards ran toward the fire, orders dissolved. Into panic, Caleb ran the opposite way. He knew every corridor, every stair, every shadow. He reached Eleanor's door and forced the locks open. She stood waiting, already dressed in dark clothes, fear and hope burning equally in her eyes. You came, she whispered. I promised, Caleb said. They moved quickly through the back halls. Eleanor struggled, her pregnancy heavy, her body weak from months of deprivation, but she refused to stop. Dogs began barking. Someone had noticed. Caleb half carried her across the fields as flames roared behind them and voices shouted commands. The chase began. Reached the river just before dawn. Caleb waded upstream with Eleanor clinging to him, masking their scent. Ice-cold water numbed their legs. but they kept moving until they reached the mountains. They hid for days in caves and ravines. Food was scarce. Eleanor weakened rapidly. Her labor began early. Caleb found help among a hidden community of escaped slaves, men and women who had built a fragile life beyond the reach of plantations. They took Eleanor in. The birth was brutal. For 2 days and 1 night, Eleanor fought between life and death. Caleb stayed outside the shelter, pacing, praying to any god who would listen. At sunrise, a child cried. A daughter. Eleanor held her only briefly. She smiled once peacefully, then slipped away. Caleb fell to his knees. He named the child Rose, for love, for blood, for freedom. Years later, stories spread of a woman who escaped captivity, of a man who burned a plantation for love, of a child raised free in the mountains. Solitude. Plantation was rebuilt, but it was never the same. Some said the land stayed cursed. Others said it remembered, because history is not always written by victors. Sometimes it is whispered by fire, by blood, by love that refused to die.